Welcome to the consultation room. If you have ever sat across from a patient and just felt completely, totally overwhelmed by the sheer complexity and chaos of their mind, well, you're not alone. We have literally all been there. Today, in this explainer, we're going to unpack the 4 foundational frameworks of dynamic psychiatry. Consider this your masterclass in building a clinical toolkit that will actually anchor you in the room when things get intense.
Let's kick things off with this profound truth from Kurt Lowen. Theory isn't just some dry academic history you memorize to pass your boards. It is absolutely, without a doubt, the most practical, vital instrument you possess as a clinician. When the clinical material gets chaotic, when the patient sitting 2 feet away from you is in crisis, your theoretical framework is your anchor. It tells you what to say, when to say it, and honestly, crucially, when to just remain silent.
The metaphor here is very deliberate. If you don't have a theoretical map to get you past merely cataloging a patient's symptoms, you are going to get lost at sea in the cavernous, dark waters of their inner experience. Diagnostic labels are fine, but we need more than that. We need a sextant to navigate the actual living reality of their suffering.
So here is our roadmap for this explainer. We'll start with navigating the mind, then move through ego psychology, object relations, self-psychology, attachment theory, and finally wrap up with integrating your clinical toolkit.
All right, part 1, navigating the patient's mind.
Which brings us right into part 2, ego psychology and defenses.
Okay, derived from Freud, the structural model maps the mind not as some unified, peaceful whole, but as an active battleground. Imagine the mind as an iceberg. The conscious ego sits right above the water. It's the executive organ trying desperately to manage reality. Down below the surface is the id, a completely unconscious agency that's basically just demanding the immediate discharge of raw instinctual tension. And then you have the superego, dictating these rigid moral constraints. The ego is constantly trying to mediate between these warring factions, and when it fails, the resulting anxiety forces the ego to deploy defense mechanisms.
This brings us to a beautiful concept called compromise formation. The key takeaway here is that neurotic symptoms aren't just random errors. Actually, scratch that, they're more than just adaptive. They are highly creative solutions to an internal war. Take an accountant who acts overly obsequious toward a boss he secretly, intensely resents. His extreme politeness acts as a defense against his wish to attack. But at the exact same time, his irritatingly sycophantic behavior suddenly punishes the boss anyway. It grants him a disguised, aggressive gratification. That is compromise formation in action.
Now, to protect itself, the ego utilizes a hierarchy of defenses. Assessing a patient's defensive profile is basically your best clinical barometer for their overall psychological organization. Are they relying heavily on primitive defenses like splitting, higher-level neurotic defenses like rationalization, or maybe mature defenses like humor? But listen, a quick word of caution for your practice. Never use the word primitive as a pejorative. Under immense stress, trauma, or severe illness, every single one of us has the capacity to fall right back on primitive defenses.
Let's shift gears to part 3, object relations theory.
Object relation shifts our entire focus away from Freud's instinctual drives and looks instead at the internalization of entire relationships. Because this framework often deals with severe personality disorders, you are going to see a heavy reliance on primitive defenses. Chief among them is projective identification. It's notoriously complex, but it's essentially a profound method of interpersonal communication that unfolds in 3 distinct steps. Let's break it down.
Right. So, in step 1, the patient disavows a bad object, a totally unacceptable part of themselves, and then they project it directly onto you. Then, in step 2, they exert this subtle, relentless interpersonal pressure to force you to behave exactly like that object. I want you to hear this loud and clear. If you are ever sitting with a patient and find yourself inexplicably enraged, entirely bored, or suddenly punitive, you are likely experiencing projective counter-identification. You've caught the projection.
But step 3 is where the real therapeutic magic happens. Instead of acting out that toxic projection and just cramming it back down the patient's throat, your job is to be a container. You process that projected material, you modify it through your own psychological resilience, and you hand it back. The patient can then safely re-inject a modified, manageable version of their own mind. This right here is the very mechanism of deep psychological change.
Moving right along to part 4, self-psychology and needs.
Heinz Kohut radically changed our field.
He argued that some patients aren't suffering from an internal conflict of drives at all, but rather from a defective self that was frozen by early empathic failures. For these folks, others are not experienced as completely separate individuals. They are experienced as self-objects, literal extensions of the self that provide necessary psychological functions. Think about it. We all need self-objects like oxygen in the atmosphere for our entire lives. Your clinical job here is absolutely not to frustrate these needs, but to provide the sustained, empathic understanding required to heal a fragmented self.
When you are sitting in that chair, you must recognize the transference in the room. Are they exhibiting a mirror transference, kind of performing to earn the gleam of your validation? Or are they exhibiting an idealizing transference, trying to bask in your reflection, perceiving you as this all-powerful, soothing figure whose mere presence calms their disintegration anxiety? Correctly identifying this dynamic completely dictates how you respond empathically.
Okay, part 5, attachment theory and development. Attachment theory grounds all of this in empirical, relational behaviors designed to ensure our actual physical survival. To grasp this, we look at Margaret Mahler's developmental timeline. The infant moves from a vague dual unity with the mother, pushes through the incredibly difficult trials of separation, and ideally reaches a vital clinical milestone: object constancy. This is the ability to hold an emotionally soothing inner representation of the mother even when she is physically gone. If your patient failed to achieve this, you are going to see profound, terrifying abandonment anxiety play out right in your office. Rooted heavily in John Bowlby's pioneering work, we see exactly how early proximity strategies harden into adult attachment styles, and recognizing these patterns is paramount for a clinician. For instance, empirical evidence clearly shows that an unresolved or disorganized attachment style strongly predicts severe childhood trauma and deep vulnerabilities to borderline personality pathology. These are patients who completely lacked a coherent strategy for dealing with separation distress in infancy, which results in those massive, chaotic interpersonal storms you'll see in their adult relationships.
And finally, part 6, integrating your clinical toolkit.
The reality of clinical practice is that the patient sitting across from you exhibits both conflict and deficit. As the literature notes, our theories are just metaphors, and like all metaphors, at some point they break down. Never, ever rigidly force your clinical material into a single neat theory. Don't make the patient fit your map. You might use ego psychology to understand their defenses at minute 10, and then pivot to self-psychology to provide empathic validation at minute 40. Let the patient lead you to the framework that matches their lived experience.
So I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought as you finish up this explainer and head back out to your practice. When the waters get dark and the unconscious material feels entirely overwhelming, will you rely blindly on a rigid theoretical map? Or will you use your integrated, dynamic toolkit to bravely navigate the actual, living, breathing human being sitting right in front of you?